Today on Straight Talk Africa, political tensions are rising in the Democratic Republic of Congo. All indications suggest President Kabila is maneuvering to stay in power longer than the constitutional mandate. That's coming up next, right here on Straight Talk Africa. Hello, welcome to Straight Talk Africa, live from the Voice of America studios here in Washington. It's Wednesday, May 11th. I am Shaka Ssali.
And hello to all our viewers and listeners on the continent and elsewhere. I'm Ayan Bior, your social media reporter.
Today, we'll talk about governance issues and the political tensions in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
And coming up later in our STA inbox, our audience has weighed in on our topic through emails and Facebook comments, and we'll reveal some of them ahead on Straight Talk Africa.
We have a problem now.
A week ago, Moise Katumbi announced his candidacy for president of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Days later, nearly 1,000 supporters joined him when he was summoned to court. Prosecutors accused him of recruiting mercenaries. Katumbi told the court he has no plans to overthrow the government of President Joseph Kabila by force, and he says he was unaware that his new security advisor had U.S. military ties. Katumbi and his supporters say the charges are politically motivated. The nation's democratic constitution became law in 2006. It makes President Joseph Kabila ineligible for another term. The opposition says President Kabila intends to stay in power and is maneuvering to do so. Ruling party members in parliament are petitioning the Constitutional Court to interpret the term limit mandate. The Deputy National Speaker of Parliament says it expires when a new president is installed, not elected.
If there are contradictions in the interpretation, we ask the court for an interpretation that will be accepted by everyone.
The opposition says the constitutional mandate is clear, but accuses the court of being biased towards Kabila.
These people now want the Constitutional Court rule in his favor.
One Kinshasa resident agrees.
I don't think the court benefits the Congolese people and will rule in favor of those who have done nothing for us.
Despite a contingent of United Nations peacekeepers, the UN reports increasing clashes between opposition supporters and police.
A new UN report highlights a worrying clampdown on opposition, media, and civil society in the Democratic Republic of the Congo since the beginning of the year. It also stresses the need to guarantee political and civil rights ahead of key elections.
Moise Katumbi is the former governor of mineral-rich Katanga province. The opposition candidate also owns a popular soccer team. President Joseph Kabila has not announced any intentions, and the ruling party has not named a replacement candidate. And the Election Commission has said budgetary and logistical problems could delay the vote up to a year. Paul Cisco, VOA News.
Thanks, Paul, for that report. Joining us here in our Washington studios are two distinguished guests. Dr. Pierre Englebert, author and professor of politics at Pomona College in Claremont, California, and Dr. J. Peter Pham, Director, Africa Center, Atlantic Council, here in Washington, D.C. We invited Francois Barumwene, the Democratic Republic of Congo's ambassador to the United States, but he declined due to what he said was a scheduling conflict. Well, gentlemen, I have to say I'm profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the opportunity to host you on Straight Talk Africa.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
You're most welcome, and especially for you, Pierre. It is the first time. It's a pleasure, of course, having you on the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, you heard earlier today that the important constitutional court back in Kinshasa seems in fact to be on the same page with President Kabila, that he shouldn't in fact be in a hurry to leave State House Kinshasa. Your reaction?
It's not much of a surprise, I would think. He, of course, appointed that court, appointed the people on that court. And so, for a while there was some ambiguity in the extent to which President Kabila would want to stay in power, although most people suspected that was the goal of the regime. And they've been lining up their cards in such a way that there's at least a legal veneer to that. And I think the judgment of the court today confirms that strategy. The idea that, even though the elections are scheduled for November, and that technically after December 19, the president should not be in power anymore, now they have some sort of judicial, legal endorsement of the idea that, yes, it's constitutional for him to stay there on account of them not being able to schedule or organize the elections.
Now, the government, of course, says that the court made an independent decision. Under no circumstances, of course, was it intimidated or, in a way, pressured really to reach that decision. And yet, of course, you hear from opposition party forces saying that, hey, everything in Kinshasa is run by one man. To what extent is there, in fact, checks and balances in the DRC?
That's a great question. There really are two overlapping systems. You have a formal system of checks and balance and of, division of power with a judicial system, judiciary that's technically independent, and that's true. However, there's also the politics of patronage and the politics of personal rule. And it's very hard, even if you're in a position of formal independence, autonomy in parliament or in the judiciary, to actually work independently from the executive and from the networks of power that really emanate from the presidency. So I would think that, yes, formally the regime is right that this is an independent institution, but politically I don't think they have room to make independent decisions.
You don't think they do? What about you, Dr. Pham?
I fully agree with my good friend, Dr. Englebert. There's a veneer of legality, a veneer of independence, but in reality, a combination of hard pressure from the regime and the soft pressure of personal interests and the patronage networks render any decision really the responsibility of one man. It all emanates from the head of the regime itself, President Kabila. And in a way, this so-called judicial decision rewards the poor governance. If you're in power, you have the responsibility not only to govern, but to prepare the election that is to come at the end of your term. And failing to do that by making adequate provision for the Electoral Commission to have a budget and to have people, and then rewarding you by the failure to carry out your duty, which includes ensuring a legal constitutional succession.
What about the Electoral Commission, which also says that it is independent, and it in fact says that it has budgetary problems, it has no funding? Who actually funds the Electoral Commission in the DRC?
And given the fact that in recent years macroeconomic growth has been good at the macro level in the DRC, government revenues have been up, it's the government's responsibility to fund. It's part of its duties. If you swear, as President Kabila did at his last inauguration, to defend the Constitution, to carry out the laws, and execute what is on the books, that includes making provision to fund the Electoral Commission. To now plead poverty and to benefit from it is the height of cynicism.
Pierre, what about the president's argument, for example, that what is needed in Congo right now really is not an election. What is needed is a census.
Well, there hasn't been a census in Congo since 1984, right? And that was the first one ever. So there's only been one census in more than 50 years of independence.
That was under Mobutu.
That was under Mobutu, correct. Now, I agree that the country needs a census. It's very important to identify who's a citizen, what age they are, and much more than just for election, but of course it relates to the electoral roll also. But he's been president for, at least elected for 10 years, and before that for another 5 years. Nobody stopped him from doing this. They could have done a census. The fact that now you come right before the election and say, oh, we need a census, is essentially an acknowledgement of the incompetence of your regime until now.
So what do you think motivates him really to do what he seems to be doing apparently? Is it because he happens to live in a region really? If you look around, you look south of him in Angola, you have José dos Santos, who obviously has been there for almost 37 years. If you look across the river Congo, you have Sassou Nguesso, who's been in and out for about 32 years. If you go across to Rwanda, you have the potential of a presidential monarch in Paul Kagame. And if you go a little bit further to Uganda, you have the dean of course, the shifting of the constitutional goalposts. What makes Kabila unique in the region, really?
Well, you're right that in this respect he is not unique. Starting in the early 1990s, there was that wave of democratization across the continent. In some countries it held, but in many countries the return of more patrimonial, personal rule politics has crept in. And some regimes like Sassou Nguesso have managed to kind of navigate that. And in Congo, there really was significant hope 10 years ago that things would change, that this might be a transformative moment, and that the Congolese had come together for a big national dialogue, and there was a big transition period, a constitution approved by 84% of the people. And so maybe Congo was finally being ushered into a new era of democratic, accountable, transparent governance. Little by little over this period, starting I would say probably around 2009 already, the regime has kind of eroded these new liberties and this empowerment of citizens, and progressively gone back to very much a Mobutu-like regime, I would think. But you're right that it's not unique to Congo. Now, Congo might be unique in the sense that there is quite a bit of resistance to this, unlike maybe what we saw with Sassou Nguesso or what we see in Angola and Uganda. But it's not unique in the sense of a certain type of politics reclaiming dominance over formerly democratic institutions. And I think that's a worrisome trend across the continent.
What about the fact that there is a precedence? When you go back to the colonial days, Congo happened, in fact, to have been a personal property of the king of Belgium.
Yes, and it's the great tragedy of Congo that it's never broken free of that historical legacy. It started out with the violence, the absolutely reprehensible violence done to the peoples of that area by the adventures of King Leopold. And unfortunately, it's only gotten worse over the years. You had Mobutu, which Dr. Englebert just referred to, and then we have now this regression. If we look very closely at the governance record of Kabila, what we have is a regression to what has very sadly been the tragic norm of the Congo. And that really is the real tragedy, that this country, which was once described as a geological scandal, all the riches in the world, even at today's deflated prices, we're talking $20+ trillion worth of mineral resources, and yet the great poverty, the lack of services, and even the lack of basic respect for the rule of law and the rights of the citizen.
We could probably, in fact, inform our audience that the uranium that was used to build a nuclear bomb, the bomb that was, of course, thrown on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, actually came from the Congo.
Yes, and all of our electronic devices that many of us rely on, day to day, these would not be possible without the rare earth minerals coming out of the Congo.
Coltan.
Yes.
That is a country, arguably, perhaps one of the richest, frankly, on this planet Earth, because you name it, it is there, and yet the people are very poor.
Yes.
So what's missing here?
Well, I think what's missing has been governance. We've had people ruling but not governing, providing the basic goods and services that citizens have an absolute right to expect, and which is the norm to expect. But we don't have it. We have a record of plunder. We have a report coming out that will be released tomorrow at the Atlantic Council that Pierre has authored, looking very closely at this issue and taking stock of what has happened during Kabila's period in power in the Congo.
Very interesting. Now we will pause for a short break and would like to remind you that Straight Talk Africa is now on the social networking website Twitter, and we are tweeting live. Follow us at VOA Shaka, that's VOA Shaka, and join in on today's discussion with your questions and comments. Don't forget to use the hashtag, and we are still on Facebook. Just enter the keyword Straight Talk Africa, become a fan and connect with other friends of the Voice of America. We'll be right back with you, so please don't go away.
Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. They tell you what people are talking about. So, for an in-depth look at the stories trending high on social media, turn to #VOA. It's not your typical talk show. From politics to pop culture, #VOA brings in the people leading the conversation, engages the audience, and gets answers to your questions. #VOA. Smart talk for smart people.
I'm Milar Sega. I'm the host of VOA's The Correspondents, a roundup of the world's top stories with analysis from our dedicated reporters. It's really a conversation the same way that you would bring a friend to your home and ask them what's going on. And our correspondents will do that and answer those questions through their own eyes.
That appears a false choice in more ways than one.
We can't actually put you there, but we can come pretty close. In 30 minutes, we'll show you the world.
We're talking, of course, about the Democratic Republic of the Congo, even though, of course, some people will tell you that even though it is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, when it comes to democracy, it seems to, in fact, have a democracy deficit. Is that something that you would agree with?
I would say that's correct, yeah.
You would say that is correct.
Yes.
Now, you just made a very important research, which you are due to share with the rest of the world tomorrow. And it is called Congo Blues, Scoring Kabila's Rule. What inspired you to do that type of research?
I've been working on Congo since about 2000, when I was still at war. Mm-hmm. And at the time I was very interested in the dimensions of the war and what the possibilities of escaping conflict. Mm-hmm. And then I've stayed interested in the country over time, and I was, like many others, very enthusiastic when the transition period ended in 2006 with a new regime and hopeful. And so, as you said earlier, there's a long legacy of bad governance and of exploitation in Congo. I mean, it was really set up as a country, a state pretending to have institutions, but really an enterprise of theft to begin with. Let's be honest, Leopold II went there to steal, to extract, to dominate. And Belgian colonization was by and large the same thing. And then Mobutu reproduced that pattern. And there was expectation, and I hope that things could change. That, maybe civil society and opposition and groups that didn't have a voice until then understood the consequence of previous regime, and that the donors also stepped in, and that we could really transform this country. And there was hope. And I've like others, I've been disappointed, but I've tried to make sense of it, try to understand what pulls Congo away from this democratic potential.
What about some critics who say that there was a very, very brief interlude, especially when the Congo regained its political independence back in 1960, that for a brief period you had a gentleman by the name Patrice Emery Lumumba. What do we know about Lumumba? If in fact Lumumba had lived, what difference could he probably have made? And the other important question, perhaps, which are the forces really that assassinated him and put Mobutu Sese Seko in place, mm-hmm. who stayed there for 32 years?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good question. I'll tell you what, I have mixed feelings about Lumumba myself. I can certainly see his appeal and the fact that he represents a vision and is definitely a charismatic leader who can mobilize people to this day, mobilize youth, and mm-hmm. and has a worthwhile objective. But Lumumba had a mixed record as a politician. I think he made some significant mistake that very quickly weakened his position mm-hmm. As soon as the Belgians left.
For example?
For example, he agreed with the Belgians in keeping a very strong Belgian presence and in having a constitution and a system that was still only partly independent, but it was a fairly realistic decision. But then as soon as the day of the independence came, he gave a speech that was very uplifting in many ways, but also led to a quick spread of mutinies and people being fed up with the system that he had himself endorsed. And so he kind of shot himself in the foot to some extent.
He was, of course, also an admirer and very, very loyal to Ghanaian founding leader, the Osajefo, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure he had Nkrumah's touch for all things politics, but certainly you can't blame his intention, And I don't know what would have happened if he had been there, but certainly he alienated a lot of people. Of course, the Belgians did not like him to begin with, and were reluctantly putting up with him. but he didn't make things easier when he went after the king and when he went after the Belgians at the time. And of course, then, he couldn't keep the country together, so some interests thought that maybe it was better to play the card of Katanga, which had the resources, and quickly there was a coalescence of domestic and international interests that undermine the future of Congo. So there's plenty of blame to share. There's no doubt about that.
You're talking about Shombe here.
Yeah.
Shombe, in fact, coming from Katanga, and here we're talking about Moise Katumbi. In fact, I think Shombe was Moise Shombe, correct?
It was Moise also, you're right. Yes.
Very interesting.
To Moses, yeah.
Very interesting. Now, in your Congo Blues, you talk about, among other things, that you refer, for example, to the war in the DRC as a decade of savage war. What exactly do you mean by that? Are you suggesting that there have been some civilized wars somewhere?
Well, I think that, to some extent, you can certainly say that war is part of many civilizations. The savage dimension here does not refer to people, but refer to the amount of violence and the degree to which the war has affected the dignity and the life of people. So, even though the war itself might not have had always high peaks of violence, it's estimated that more than 5 million people died of it directly or indirectly over the years. Now, that's an incredible toll. And if you go to Eastern Congo, you go to the Kivus, you go to North Katanga, to Maniema, to Oriental, the amount of human destitution from the war is overwhelming. And so there's a degree of savagery in the fact that this kind of conflict ruins people's lives, whether they kill them or not. The amount of alienation and endangerment of people's lives is just overwhelming.
But what about the external influence?
There's been
the external
plenty,
intervention. You're talking about Rwanda. You're talking about Uganda. You're talking about Burundi. You're talking about all sorts of countries.
Yeah, here. Zimbabwe, Angola, you name
Chad.
it. Yeah, Chad, even Chad, yeah. No, there's no doubt that, at some point during the war, Congo became a bit of a black hole. The weakness of its own institutions sucked in many other actors. Right? Now, certainly Uganda, Rwanda, Zimbabwe, Angola had their own motivation, some economic, some strategic, to intervene beyond caring for Congo itself. But Congo made it possible. Mobutu's failure at governing and the extent to which he manipulated institutions to maintain himself in power weakened the state in such a way that it became an easy place for a small country like Rwanda to invade and almost control for a while.
What about others who will also say, yes, countries like Rwanda, Uganda obviously had their own interests and all that kind of stuff, but that in fact at the end of the day they were proxy forces for larger and more important parties, really?
You hear that discourse quite a bit, and it's popular in Congo. And a lot of Congolese have what I would call sometimes a conspiracy way of thinking about stuff. Now, there's no doubt that historically, right, the U.S. was at least indirectly involved in the assassination of Lumumba. The U.S. certainly sponsored Mobutu for a long time and other Western forces. There's no doubt that, you can certainly make a plausible argument in terms of neo-colonial relationship. In terms of the war and the more recent events, I think it's much more ambiguous than that. There's no doubt that the West has advantage there, but American investors would prefer a much more peaceful state in which to do business. It's a tough place to operate. So it's not a clear thing about, Rwanda doing the bidding of the West in terms of stealing the resource of Congo. That's a narrative that you hear a lot there. I think the reality is a lot more complex than that, not to deny that there's exploitation.
Peter, I was told one time by a gentleman by the name of Howard French, who you might in fact be familiar with, because he used to be a key journalist for the New York Times, covering Africa from Abidjan. And he covered the Congo very, very closely. And he talks about one time when Bill Clinton, who was then president, personally wrote a letter to Mobutu Sese Seko, in a sense, to really step down. This was before Mobutu was, of course, attacked by the neighboring countries back in 97?
Yes.
Yeah. What about that? That, in fact, Clinton's ambassador to the United Nations at the time personally took that letter and handed it to Mobutu Sese Seko, who read it and said, wait a minute, I have been with you all this time. I have been delivering. What is wrong with you? I'm going nowhere.
Yes, and today the current Bill Clinton's successor in the Oval Office, President Barack Obama, last year personally called Joseph Kabila to urge him to follow the good example of Goodluck Jonathan, who, despite wanting to stay on, accepted the democratic verdict and had the historic transition in Nigeria to do the same. It's a message that has been repeated by the Vice President, the Secretary of State, and other officials down the line. The U.S. position has been very clear. The Congolese constitution needs to be respected, and Joseph Kabila can best assure his place in history by respecting it. Unfortunately, I think it's been an exercise in futility, because all indications are that that appeal, however reasonable, has fallen on deaf ears.
When these people meet, really, what do they talk about? For example, the Secretary of State, John Kelly, reportedly met with President Kabila in New York recently. What do they actually talk about?
I think part of it is urging someone like him to... There is a future. I think one of the problems was the original sin, if you will, in this was back in 2001, when his father, Laurent Désiré Kabila, was assassinated by his own bodyguard. And then Joseph was 29, did not even speak Lingala, the lingua franca of the western part of the country, was stepped into the office without even the color of law, and the international community acquiesced to it. And since then, he's been there, and he's a young man. He's still in his early 40s. He has a long life ahead of him. We've established a principle of impunity, and now what's he going to do? There have been reports, and the Panama Papers have augmented, that he and his family have enriched themselves. Are they going to be able to keep their wealth? Is he going to have to look over his shoulder for the rest of his days, fearing prosecution either for human rights abuses, war crimes from the Civil War, or the ill-gotten gains of the last few years? So that's not a very attractive future for him. So one has to try to persuade someone like him that there is a future that doesn't necessarily entail a one-way plane ticket to The Hague.
What about the Panama Papers? Is there anything more that you can tell us about that, in fact, as it concerns Joseph Kabila? Because I saw the twin sister's name, Jeanette Kabila, being displayed very prominently. Do you have any details on that?
Well, only the details. I can relay the details that the international consortium of journalists who have this trove of documents, have been publishing their analyses, have put out there. And it appears that not only is Sister Jeanette displayed there, but she seems to have had hidden interests in some of the more lucrative concessions and licenses, including in the telecom sector in the country. One of the president's closest business associates, Israeli billionaire Dan Gertler, is mentioned some 200 times in the documents that have been publicized so far, including, interestingly, in a report just released by Global Witness, the NGO, looking at these documents, that apparently some of the concessions for petroleum in the Democratic Republic of Congo were given to firms that were created through the mechanisms of the shell companies run through Panama, and that somewhere in the note, and again, this is the analysis that's been published by those who have access to the papers, something like $1.3 billion worth of revenue that belongs to the Congolese state have evaporated into these shell companies. So there's quite a lot, and I'm sure there's more to come.
Very interesting, because long ago, during the Carter administration, there was a story about Mobutu Sese Seko coming to Washington and asking for aid when he was asked to perhaps to borrow his government, the government of Congo, because he was reputed to be one of the 5 richest men in the world. He responded by saying that, I don't trust the Congolese government because it may not be able to pay back. Very interesting. You are tuned into Straight Talk Africa. We'll have more of a discussion in a moment. But first, here is social media reporter Ayen Bior. Take it away, Ayen.
Thanks, Shaka. And still to come, we'll reveal some of the outstanding feedback we've received from our audience through social media. But now here's our letter of the week from a Straight Talk Africa Facebook fan in Nigeria. Our letter of the week comes from Yahaya Ahmed Gumel from Nigeria, who writes, President Joseph Kabila should not remain in power because of the fact that he has served the required constitutional term limits. Any attempt to change the Constitution to pave the way for him to remain in power is a serious violation of the Constitution. Kabila should simply understand that the writing is on the wall and honorably step down. It is high time that African leaders find the cure for their power elongation disease. There is still life after the presidency.
There was action outside the debate hall.
Political season is about to change, too.
VOA News, Las Vegas.
Wherever you are, Voice of America is on. On air, reaching more than 130 million weekly, worldwide, in more than 40 languages. Online, social media, and breaking news from around the world. On the go, dozens of new features on popular platforms with new apps and trending topics. Voice of America, on air, online, on the go.
Welcome back to Straight Talk Africa, live from Washington. Once again, it's time to bring in my colleague, Ayen Bior. Take it away again, Ayen.
Well, thanks again, Shaka. Now, we've received tremendous feedback in our STA inbox to this week's question. Political tensions remain high in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where opponents of President Kabila say he is trying to cling to power beyond the end of his mandate in 2016. This leads us to our question of the week, which asks, do you think President Joseph Kabila should remain in power? Well, before we begin, I'd like to thank all of you for using our social media platforms to communicate with us. And another reminder that we are tweeting live today. Use the hashtag VOADRC. And if you haven't yet, please do follow us at VOA Shaka. And speaking of, let's go to a tweet from E. Kachele, who writes, no, President Kabila should not remain in power. He should respect the Constitution for the benefit of his people. We have another tweet from Mukoni J.E., who tweets, the will of the people must prevail, and let there be a level playing field for all political candidates. And our last tweet is from Justin Baraka, who tweets, what should African incumbents do when opposition leaders gain uncontrollable popular support? Well, let's go to Facebook now, where we have a comment from our Facebook fan, Bilangora Jr. in Tanzania, who writes, Kabila is a leader. Kabila is a cursed leader, He doesn't deserve to remain in power. The people's power should act on this immediately. And let's go to another comment from a Facebook fan, Amon Crucial from Uganda, who writes, obviously no. Clinging to power is one main reason why Congo is how it is now. I don't know what's wrong with African presidents. And our last Facebook comment comes from Nengalozed Nengolo in Tanzania, who writes, indeed, he can do that as long as the majority of Congolese support it. Other than that, it's time to step down. Well, Shaka, there's a lot of opinions today on social media. Your take?
Very interesting. What about you, Pierre? He can do it as long as the majority of Congolese people support it. How do you quantify that?
The majority of the Congolese people had a chance to speak up.
They support change.
In 2006, they voted on the Constitution, a new Constitution. That was the only time when they really had a chance to express themselves. They said we want a two-term presidency. They said we want decentralization. They said we want democracy. Now, you made a great point earlier when Clinton went to Mobutu to say you must step down. He said, why should I step down? I work with you. Mm-hmm. Back then, it was not the same legal environment. Now, the Congolese have had a chance after a long inter-Congolese dialogue, a 3-year transition. They were able to express themselves, very, very large majority, more than 80% of people in favor of this system. And so this is the only time when we really have been able to listen to the Congolese. The elections in 2011 were not free and fair. So if you want to say, stay in power as long as you have the support of the people, this is the only evidence we have right now, the support of the people. It's for a democratic system with 2 terms.
As a matter of fact, the man who took that letter from President Bill Clinton was Ambassador I think Bill Richardson was his ambassador to the UN at the time, who later became secretary, I believe, for energy or something of that sort. Well, thanks again for bringing us this week's audience reaction.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. And that does it for today's social media segment. Just a reminder that we appreciate all the feedback, whether it's in social media form or using other means to communicate with us. Please keep them coming. And if you are a new fan, drop us a line at africatv@voanews.com. Once again, our email address is africatv@voanews.com. Or post your comment on our Facebook page. Enter the keywords Straight Talk Africa. Be sure to visit us online at voaafrica.com, or you can join our YouTube channel. Sign up to VOA TV2 Africa and follow us on Twitter at VOA Shaka. A reminder that the show is streaming live every Wednesday. Go to VOA Straight Talk Africa TV program page on our website, or simply watch us live on your mobile device. Just download the VOA mobile app. Now let's take a look at what's on tap for next week's program. Next week on Straight Talk Africa, we'll discuss whether there is a need for a fundamental change in U.S.-Africa relations. Join host Shaka Ssali, his panel of guests, and me, Ayen Bior, your social media reporter, as we discuss the issue. That's next week on Straight Talk Africa.
Welcome back, and today we are talking about governance issues and the political tensions in the DRC. Our distinguished guests are Dr. Pierre Englebert, author and professor of politics at Pomona College in California, and Dr. J. Peter Pham, director, Africa Center, Atlantic Council here in Washington, D.C. We also invited Francois Barumwene, but he declined due to scheduling conflict, and of course that is the Congolese ambassador to the United States. Let me come back to you immediately, Pierre. In your groundbreaking research, you pretty much conclude, frankly, that the more things change in the DRC, the more they seem to remain the same. Because you talk about, for example, that Kabila's regime has proven more of the successor of Mobutu than the pioneer of a new era. How? How has he actually been able to do that? Because there is some evidence that, on the contrary, this man has been able to put in place a lot of infrastructure, that has put in place roads, schools, hospitals, and what have you.
Have you been to Congo recently?
No, I have not. In fact, I was last there in 1999, but that's a bit of what I've been reading here and there and being told by government officials.
On the issue of infrastructure, there's certainly, things were very, very bad 10 years ago, so there's been some sort of fixing up of things, and so some roads are better, particularly in Kinshasa, and a couple of roads in some other parts of the country, but it's very minimal, and most of it is, my understanding is that it's Chinese contracts, and the Chinese have been building up these roads. So if you go from the airport to downtown Kinshasa, yes, you have a nice big boulevard, Patrice Lumumba, and then Boulevard du 30 Juin, but this is not really infrastructure for the people. You have a couple of hospitals that the Chinese have built too. But by and large, this whole revolution in modernity and the famous 5 pillars campaign for infrastructure has not quite delivered, I'll tell you that. Now, in terms of your question, that Kabila has proven more of the old system, it's not quite exactly the same as Mobutu or as before. There certainly is more. There's a balance. There certainly is a dimension that has formal institution. There's some degree of functionality. There's been some improvements. For example, budget openness went from like a score of 1 out of 100 to 39 out of 100. And, there's been some improvements in some indicators. And there's some formal institutions of democracy are functioning. But as I said earlier, all of this is happening over a different layer of politics where informal patronage politics remains and where resources are being taken through the state and reallocated for personal accumulation or for political benefit. And so that system, which really was very much at the core of the Mobutu regime, has endured, has reproduced in ways that are more subtle in many ways than before. But fundamentally, I think it's the same type of system.
It's incredible because you point out, for example, that more than 80% of the population lives on $1 25 cents a day.
Under, yes.
Under $1.25 a day, in which basically really poverty really.
Yes.
80%.
The poverty remains overwhelming. There's been about 10 years of growth at 6 to 7% a year, GDP growth. That's very significant growth.
Significant,
yeah.
But where is it reflected? Is it not reflected in people's stomachs, nowhere in their neighborhoods?
That's what the Congolese will tell you. They do not see it. And there's significant grievance about that. And that's a political force to be reckoned with. People are really... They cannot believe that their country is supposedly doing so well. So clearly, the growth comes from the mining sector mostly, and the mining sector, even though it's been privatized over the years, is a sector that remains under very significant control of the government, its agencies, and its state-owned enterprises, and the money from that sector recirculates through the political elites.
And you tell us that a country, frankly, that is endowed with all this wealth, Peter earlier was telling us about, of course, coltan. I mean, you can see it reflected in cell phones, in video phones, and you name it, and what have you. You can talk about gold, you can talk about Mbuji-Mayi being perhaps the diamond capital of the world. You can talk about all sorts of things, and yet the income per capita, you say, is $380 per person?
Yeah, around 400, that's correct, yeah. And by the way, I was in Mbuji-Mayi a couple of years ago. This is the capital of former Kasai Oriental,
right,
where the MIBA, the big diamond mining company is.
Right.
Mbuji-Mayi is probably one of the poorest cities I've ever seen. It was incredible. The destitution was overwhelming.
As a matter of fact, the last time I passed through Mbuji-Mayi myself, in fact, we were on the same flight with, guess who? Joseph Kabila. Oh. He was in charge of the military at that time. His father was the president. I was coming from Lubumbashi, having interviewed his father at that time, and frankly, you could not believe that you were in Mbuji-Mayi, the diamond capital of the world, which frankly didn't seem even to have an economy based on potatoes, really. Mm-hmm. You couldn't. Mm-hmm. So what needs to be done, man? I mean, look, Congo has been politically independent since 1960. This is 2016. Mm-hmm. People like Kabila are more sophisticated, more exposed than Mobutu.
Yeah, it's a tragedy. Congo is a tragedy, The extent to which, despite this potential, and despite so many repeated attempts to set it on a more constructive and inclusive track, that the country has fallen back to really being affected by what you can call the resource curse, or the tendency of elites to dominate and exploit, and the Congolese have been unable to assert their voice as citizens. It's really there's a lack of collective action at that level.
But this is a man, frankly, that we used to have a lot of debates, and he gave me the impression of, in fact, being a Pan-Africanist. Somebody, frankly, that was very serious and wanted to make a difference, really, in his country. What could possibly have happened?
Well, I think the British 19th century statesman Lord Acton said it best: power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the incredible power that comes from having the control of the wealth that is Congo apparently went to his head and that of those around him. But one thing I would say, on the very pessimistic but realistic note that Pierre just sounded, one thing has changed, I think, a very significant one, since the days of Mobutu and earlier periods. The Congolese people today are armed with information. Technology has moved ahead. Cell phone use is up. Coverage may be spotty in some places, but it's fairly significant. And though the government occasionally shuts down SMS service, people know. And the international community has moved ahead as well. We have things like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. We have companies that publish there. So we know how much money, more or less, we have an idea of the amount of revenue that's flowing into the Congolese state. Mm-hmm. And we also know that, again, speaking of laws, the Congolese state is supposed to turn over 40% of it, the central government revenues are supposed to be handed over to the provinces. And they, in turn, have to hand over money to local government areas, which have to carry out about 24 tasks that are given to them. And we know from research and just talking to people that the money hasn't been flowing. And it's been coming in at central, but it hasn't been flowing out. And we have a rough idea. We don't have a precise idea, but we have a lot more information. And the Congolese people see for themselves in the lack of roads, the lack of services, in the misery of their conditions, and they want a better future and an opportunity to choose that future.
Very interesting. A reminder that you are tuned into Straight Talk Africa. We'll continue our discussion in a moment, so please don't go away.
We are able to touch on things that are important to people on an everyday basis. We hope that our viewers are getting inspired when they watch our show. They're getting a view of the world from a different perspective, things that perhaps are not in their immediate vicinity. Today, I could put in on the show something that is a little different, a little unique, and this gives me that inspiration to come to work.
If you like today's show, please write and tell us what you think or give us some suggestions. Be sure to tell us what station you're tuned into. Our address, Straight Talk Africa, Voice of America, 330 Independence Avenue Southwest, Washington, D.C. 20237 USA. Or send us an email at africatv@voanews.com. Log on to our website at voaafrica.com. Or post your comments on Facebook. Keywords Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you very much, Esther Gizui Yuwat. And of course, this is Straight Talk Africa, coming to you live from Washington. Coming back to you, of course, Peter, there are some cynics, in fact, who say that, when it comes to corruption, it comes to bad governance and what have you, that seems to be a monopoly, really, of Africa. Is it an African pedigree, really? You look at some examples, for example, in most recent changes in Europe. Look at the country that, was, of course, the master of Angola, or of Portugal, of Cape Verde, and what have you. When you look at that country, honestly, and you think about the 1974 Carnation Revolution, the captain's coup, honestly, Portugal. Can you believe that they just did that and the event turned into a democratic process? They have actually never looked back. Portugal is democratic. What happened to Africa, for example? I mean, look, Angola, Mozambique, you name it, except, of course, Cape Verde, little Cape Verde, perhaps.
Yes. Well, Shaka, I would reject the idea that corruption is somehow a congenital condition that Africa is condemned to living with. What I will say is there's a responsibility to go all around. There's a responsibility of the international community, which has all too long enabled or facilitated or at least condone some of these corrupt leaders. But there's a tide changing there. But there's also the responsibility of Africans themselves, both inside countries, and I think with more information, as I've said earlier, I think people are seeing something different and wanting aspiring to something different. And increasingly, although it's taking baby steps, one has to acknowledge progress, the African Union as a whole and African leaders are less. It was very telling in 2011 when Joseph Kabila essentially stole that election. It was very telling that he could only get one other African leader to attend his inauguration.
Do you have empirical evidence on that in fact he stole it?
Well, the evidence I take is the testimony of the country's Roman Catholic archbishops, who deployed more than 40,000 trained observers across the country and then pronounced the results illegitimate and not reflecting the will of the people. These are people who are not outside. They live with the people and they spoke their voice. Unfortunately, and I think it's very telling evidence that only Robert Mugabe was the only African leader who was willing to attend in person Kabila's inauguration in 2011. That's telling. Even some of our more controversial presidents who you've just named off have gotten a handful or more of their fellows to show up in solidarity. It's very telling when you only get one, and the one is Mugabe of Zimbabwe.
Very interesting. But you mentioned something interesting, which also reminded me of what, in fact, I saw today. You talked about how, of course, by no means is corruption, frankly, a monopoly of Africa or whatever. I was watching news today, and I saw Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari, who was attending a conference in London discussing corruption and what have you. And the Prime Minister of Britain, David Cameron, had actually apologized because you have a lot of stolen money, Nigerian money, in London, in the UK. And President Buhari shot back and said, I am not here for apologies. People cannot eat apologies. I want something concrete. I want our money back. And it reminded me then of back in 1985 when Major General Buhari was the military leader of Nigeria, and he gave orders to, in fact, in a sense, abduct a former Nigerian minister, Umar Diko, who apparently had run away with about 7 billion US dollars. And they actually put him in a coffin. These were Israeli Mossad and what have you. They put him in a coffin, and they were going to load him on Nigerian Airways until the British Secret Service came in and discovered him and said, no, you can't do that. And the guy, of course, stayed free. And, of course, the money remained in the United Kingdom. So you are right. It's not just about African countries. The international community has to weigh in. How do we make sure that this happens, really?
Well, I think sticking to the case of Congo, since we've been discussing it, we start now. We have to look at what's going on there now, what is obstructing the democratic transition there, and begin moving beyond, pious repetition of exhortations to respect the Constitution, have a transition, to sanctioning those individuals who are obstructing that process, those who are prolonging it, and very targeted sanctions. We're not talking about sanctioning the country. We're talking about individuals, their freedom of movement, their ability to travel and shop and enjoy luxuries of life in Europe, the Americas, or the Far East, travel bans, visa bans, asset freezes, and those people who are enabling the corrupt system in the DRC to continue. I think we have to look very seriously at that. We have to look also seriously at those who are, at this very moment, using their control or their over the levers of state power to carry out vendettas or to repress legitimate opposition voices in the country. Those should be subject to sanction, and that's where we begin. We have to begin somewhere. There's a lot of history. There are a lot of things to go over, but we have to begin with the present. The history we will address, but the present to prevent the tragedy of tomorrow.
There are times that we, of course, interact, and you talk about how countries have, of course, their vital national security interests. Would these countries really have the political will to do that? Because some of this corruption, frankly, translates into jobs in these countries.
I would argue that the long-term interest of Congo's partners lies in a stable, prosperous Congo. A country that is the largest country in sub-Saharan Africa with the wealth potential.
Second largest, actually, after Algeria.
Algeria, but in sub-Saharan Africa, the largest country.
That's right,
And with the wealth potential is if it could get going, an incredible market opportunity for outside partners. That will create, yes, you can create some jobs for bankers, lawyers, maybe not at Panamanian law firms anymore, to abate and abet corruption. But we would mutually prosper more with a prosperous, democratic, stable Congo. It would be a greater market. It would also be a more ready supply for those who are engaged in the mining sector. Would be a more reliable supply of those precious minerals that we need to maintain our modern life. So it is, one would argue, in our own interest and also in our fiscal interest. Conflict arising out of the Congo because of the lack of political space will only create humanitarian crisis, which will then be demands on our pocketbooks as taxpayers in other countries. So it's in our interest, I would argue, to pursue the interests of the Congolese people.
Very interesting. What about you, Pierre? What kind of recommendations would you come up with to help a man like Kabila or his successor kick in, frankly, what is called socio-economic justice for all?
Answering that and going back at the same time on the issue of corruption, I agree that there's nothing intrinsically more corrupt in Congo or in Africa than anywhere else. But I do think that political elites in Africa respond rationally to the kind of constraints and incentives that they face, like elites elsewhere. But in their case, that leads to more corruption in practice. So they have very weak states, inherited from colonization, with very heterogeneous societies that are very hard to keep together. I often tell my students, it's easier to be the Chancellor of Germany than it is to be the President of Burkina Faso. I mean, those are hard places to run with very few resources. So corruption often is essentially, we can think of it as an immoral thing, but you can also think of it as the oil that keeps the system together, or that prevents states from collapsing, or conflict from arising. So to some extent...
But even in a country like Equatorial Guinea, for example, frankly, where you have a lot of money, a lot of resources, especially that accrued out of oil and gas, and very few people, and you still find Theodore Obiang Basogo essentially looking or controlling the country as if it was, in fact, a personal farm.
Yes. So I think the second dimension is that there is significant impunity. So I think for many African leaders, corruption is part of a strategy of political survival and reproduction of the state. And it's possible because impunity prevails in many countries. Even with democracy, impunity prevails at home and internationally. And so I think there's not much we can do about the way the states of Africa are. We have to work with what we have. But certainly there's room to address the impunity issue. And I think one way to do that, you can certainly think of the international actors, but I think that we have, in Congo particularly, we can help empower the Congolese, the civil society, the citizens, people who, when they had a voice, asked for a different regime and have been largely sidelined politically by the closing of political freedoms, and also because they have to survive, and so they participate in a system that they may not approve of, but this is how you feed your children and how you go from day to day. You're a policeman, you will take a bribe, what have you. Now, can we empower these people? Can we work with them more strongly to help them be more of a counterweight, a countervailing influence to the domination of the state? African states, Congo, might be weak, but they're very powerful compared to their societies. There's an imbalance there, and I think there's room for intervention at that level.
When you talk about corruption, how do you relate it to political patronage?
So you can think of corruption as being the extraction of resources by state actors, and then these resources are redistributed to political clients, or to...
in exchange for political support.
In exchange for loyalty, support, or in exchange for not making trouble. So you can go with your allies or your opponents, but essentially you give everybody some sort of a vested interest in the system. They may disapprove of it on a political level, but they find that it's expedient to play with it because it's very hard to imagine an alternative.
It is very interesting because I was having a conversation with an African analyst, and he came to the conclusion that when you look at a lot of African countries where you have these dictators, especially those who have been in power for more than 15 or 20 years, that one thing that they have in common is that they have actually succeeded in institutionalizing corruption and impunity. Would you agree with that?
I think that's a fair assessment. But what you have to look is the results. These states endure. So you can say that Congo is a catastrophe, but it was not a given that Congo would survive in 1960, and it fell apart. So to some extent, African states reproduce by creating governance that's inimical to development.
Very interesting. Well, on that note, thanks to our distinguished guests, Dr. Pierre Englebert, author and professor of politics at Pham College, and Dr. J. Peter Pham, Director, Africa Center, Atlantic Council. Thanks to our affiliate stations, along with our viewers and listeners, we thank you for tuning in. For many of our Voice of America radio affiliates, Learning English is coming up next. And tomorrow morning, it's Daybreak Africa with James Bate. On behalf of the Voice of America, thanks for tuning in to Straight Talk Africa. In the meantime, get better, not bitter, DRC. And please remember to keep the African hopes alive.